December 27, 1942. Skies over Buna, New Guinea. Major Richard Dick Bong rolled his P-38 Lightning into a dive, tracking a Japanese Zero through the tropical sky at 20,000 feet. The Zero was maneuvering hard, its pilot executing a climbing spiral that would have shaken most American fighters. But Bong had been studying Japanese tactics for months, had learned to anticipate their moves, and had developed a methodical, almost scientific approach to air combat that made him the most effective fighter pilot in the Pacific theater. Bong didn't fly with the wild aggression that characterized some American aces. He didn't seek glory or take unnecessary risks. He flew with calculated precision, using the P-38's superior speed and firepower to attack from advantageous positions, breaking off when the situation didn't favor him, and never pressing an attack when doing so would expose him to counterattack. The Zero climbed steeply, trying to use its superior maneuverability to reverse the engagement and get on Bong's tail. But Bong had anticipated this. He had seen this maneuver dozens of times, knew its limitations, and had positioned himself to counter it. As the Zero reached the top of its climb and began to stall, momentarily vulnerable, Bong adjusted his aim and fired a 2-second burst from his .450 caliber machine guns and single 20mm cannon. The concentrated firepower of the P-38, 5 guns firing simultaneously from the nose, all converging on a single point, was devastating. The Zero shuddered as rounds struck its engine and cockpit. Smoke erupted, the aircraft rolled inverted, and the pilot either couldn't or didn't bail out. Bong watched the Zero spiral downward, trailing black smoke until it disappeared into the jungle below. Confirmed kill number 8. By the time Bong returned to base and filed his combat report, he had already forgotten most of the details. The engagement had been routine, almost clinical. Identify target, maneuver to favorable position, fire, confirm kill, return to base. There was no drama, no desperate maneuvering, no heroic dogfighting, just efficient application of superior tactics and firepower to eliminate an enemy aircraft. This was how Richard Bong would fight for the next 2.5 years, accumulating 40 confirmed kills, more than any other American pilot in history, through consistent, methodical application of tactical principles that he refined through each engagement. He wasn't the most naturally talented pilot, wasn't the best marksman, wasn't the most aggressive fighter. But he was the most effective, and effectiveness in air combat is measured simply: kills versus losses, living versus dying. This is the story of Richard Bong, the farm boy from Wisconsin, who became America's ace of aces, who shot down 40 Japanese aircraft while developing the tactics that would be taught to American fighter pilots for decades afterward. It's the story of how a quiet, unassuming young man became the deadliest fighter pilot in American history, not through reckless courage, but through disciplined skill, careful study, and refusal to take unnecessary risks. It's also the story of survival and loss, how Bong survived hundreds of combat missions in one of the war's most dangerous theaters, only to die in a peacetime accident just months after returning home. How he became a legend to the American public, but remained uncomfortable with fame and recognition. And how his legacy influenced American fighter tactics from World War II through the jet age and beyond. To understand how Richard Bong became America's top ace, we need to understand who he was before the war and how he developed the approach to combat that made him so extraordinarily effective. Richard Ira Bong was born on September 24, 1920, in Superior, Wisconsin, a small city on the shore of Lake Superior near the Minnesota border. He was the eldest of 9 children in a Swedish-American farming family. His father, Carl, was a farmer who worked hard to support the large family during the Depression. His mother, Dora, managed the household and raised the children with Midwestern values: hard work, modesty, responsibility, practical education over abstract learning. Dick, as he was known to family and friends, grew up on the farm helping with chores, learning practical mechanical skills, and attending local schools. He was a good student, but not exceptional, more interested in practical matters than in academics. He showed early aptitude for mechanics and machines, could fix farm equipment when it broke, and was generally handy with tools. The farm was isolated enough that entertainment was self-made. Dick and his siblings hunted, fished, and explored the woods around their property. Dick became a good shot with rifles and shotguns, developing the hand-eye coordination and spatial judgment that would later prove valuable in aerial gunnery. But his shooting skills were unremarkable by rural Wisconsin standards. Many farm boys were good shots, and Dick was simply one of them. What distinguished Dick from his peers was his fascination with aviation. In the 1920s and 1930s, aviation was transitioning from barnstorming spectacle to practical transportation, and rural America was captivated by the romance of flight. Dick read everything he could find about aviation, studied photographs of aircraft, and dreamed about flying, despite having no obvious path to achieving that dream. Farm boys from Wisconsin didn't typically become pilots. Aviation was expensive, required education and training that weren't accessible to rural families, and offered no clear career path for someone from Dick's background. But in 1938, when Dick was 18, an opportunity emerged that would change his life. The federal government, recognizing the need to expand American aviation capabilities as war threatened in Europe, established the Civilian Pilot Training Program, CPTP. The program provided flight training at reduced cost to college students, aiming to create a pool of trained pilots who could transition to military service if needed. Dick enrolled at Superior State Teachers College, now University of Wisconsin-Superior, partly because the college offered CPTP training. He studied education, preparing for a career as a teacher, but his real focus was on the flying program. In 1940, Dick completed primary flight training through CPTP, earning his private pilot license and discovering that he had natural aptitude for flying. The aptitude wasn't in exceptional natural talent or dramatic flying skills. Dick was a competent pilot, smooth, careful, methodical. He didn't excel at aerobatics or show-off flying, but he was precise, consistent, and demonstrated good judgment about aircraft limitations and safe operations. These qualities, while less dramatic than natural genius, were actually more valuable for military aviation, where consistent competence mattered more than occasional brilliance. In May 1941, 7 months before Pearl Harbor, but at a time when American involvement in the war seemed increasingly likely, Dick enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Corps Aviation Cadet Program. He was 20 years old, had 1 year of college education and basic flight training, and had no clear idea what military service would involve beyond the opportunity to fly more sophisticated aircraft than the light trainers he had learned on. Dick's military flight training began at Luke Field, Arizona, in summer 1941. The training was intensive, ground school covering navigation, meteorology, aircraft systems, and military procedures, combined with flight training that progressed from basic aircraft to increasingly complex and powerful machines. The washout rate was high. Approximately 50% of cadets failed to complete training, washed out for various reasons, including poor flying skills, inability to handle academic requirements, or medical issues. Dick completed training successfully, but not exceptionally. His instructors noted that he was a solid, reliable pilot who followed procedures carefully and demonstrated good judgment. He wasn't the most talented student in his class, wasn't the best at aerobatics or instrument flying, and didn't show particular promise as a combat pilot. But he graduated, received his wings and commission as a second lieutenant, and was assigned to advanced fighter training. In November 1941, just weeks before Pearl Harbor, Dick was assigned to Hamilton Field, California, for transition training to the P-38 Lightning, the twin-engine fighter that would become his aircraft throughout his combat career. The P-38 was one of the most distinctive aircraft of World War II. Twin-boom design with the cockpit and armament mounted in a central nacelle between the booms, two engines providing speed and power, and concentrated nose armament that made it a devastating gun platform. The P-38 was also challenging to fly. The twin engines required careful management. If one engine failed, the asymmetric thrust would cause violent yaw that could spin the aircraft out of control if the pilot didn't respond correctly. The counter-rotating propellers eliminated torque effects that affected single-engine fighters, but created their own handling peculiarities that pilots had to learn. And the aircraft's size and weight made it less maneuverable than smaller single-engine fighters, requiring different tactical approaches. Dick took to the P-38 naturally. His methodical, careful approach to flying suited the aircraft's requirements. He mastered engine management, learned to handle emergencies smoothly, and developed understanding of the P-38's strengths and limitations that would inform his combat tactics later. He didn't love the P-38 in the emotional way some pilots loved their aircraft. He viewed it as a tool, appreciated its capabilities, accepted its limitations, and learned to use it effectively. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, Dick had been flying the P-38 for just over a month. He was still in training, still learning advanced tactics, still completely inexperienced in combat. But America was now at war, and Dick's training would accelerate as the military desperately needed combat pilots to replace losses and to build up forces for offensive operations. Through early 1942, Dick continued training while also conducting defensive patrols along the West Coast. There was genuine fear that Japan might attack the mainland United States, and fighter squadrons were maintained on high alert to intercept any approaching Japanese aircraft. The patrols were boring, routine, and uneventful. Dick flew hundreds of hours of patrol missions and never encountered enemy aircraft. But he used the time productively. He practiced gunnery, learned formation flying, studied tactics, and flew constantly to build experience and proficiency. By mid-1942, Dick had accumulated over 500 flight hours in the P-38, making him one of the more experienced P-38 pilots in the Army Air Forces, despite never having seen combat. His experience nearly ended his career in a bizarre incident that became legendary in Air Force folklore. In May 1942, while conducting a low-level flight over San Francisco Bay, Dick flew down Market Street in downtown San Francisco at rooftop level, then executed a barrel roll around the center span of the Golden Gate Bridge. The stunt was unauthorized, dangerous, and violated multiple regulations. It was also witnessed by hundreds of civilians and by senior officers who were not amused by a junior officer's showboating. Dick was brought before his commanding officer, General George Kenney, and expected to be severely punished, possibly court-martialed, almost certainly grounded, likely washed out of flying service. But Kenney, who would later become Dick's greatest supporter and advocate, saw something in the young pilot beyond the stupid stunt. He saw someone who could handle the P-38 with sufficient skill to execute aerobatics at low altitude in confined spaces, who had confidence in his flying abilities, and who was worth salvaging despite poor judgment. Kenny's punishment was creative. He assigned Dick to meet with his wife and explain to her personally why performing unauthorized aerobatics over a major city was inappropriate. The public humiliation of having to apologize to a general's wife for showing off was, in Kenny's view, more effective punishment than formal discipline. Kenny also apparently recognized that Dick's stunt, while reckless, demonstrated flying skills that would be valuable in combat if channeled appropriately. In September 1942, Dick was assigned to the 9th Fighter Squadron, 49th Fighter Group, and deployed to the Southwest Pacific Theater, specifically to New Guinea, where American and Australian forces were fighting desperate defensive campaigns against Japanese advances. The deployment would transform Dick from an inexperienced pilot who had performed one stupid stunt into America's deadliest fighter pilot. The Southwest Pacific Theater in late 1942 was one of the most challenging environments for air combat. The theater stretched across thousands of miles of ocean and jungle, with primitive airfields, minimal infrastructure, tropical diseases, and harsh living conditions. The Japanese controlled most of the region, had air superiority, and were conducting offensive operations aimed at isolating Australia and securing the resources of Southeast Asia. American and Australian forces were fighting to stop Japanese advances, to secure Port Moresby in New Guinea as a base for future offensive operations, and simply to survive against an enemy that was better positioned, better supplied, and more experienced. The air war was brutal. Aircraft losses were heavy on both sides. Pilots were flying missions in aircraft that were often poorly maintained due to lack of spare parts and maintenance facilities. And the tactical situation meant that American pilots were often outnumbered and fighting over enemy-held territory, where being shot down meant death or capture rather than rescue. Into this environment, Richard Bong arrived in September 1942, assigned to fly combat missions from primitive airfields in New Guinea, to contest Japanese air superiority, and to protect Allied ground forces from Japanese air attack. He was 22 years old, had never been in combat, and was about to begin the career that would make him legendary. His first combat mission was on December 27, 1942, when he encountered and shot down 2 Japanese aircraft, a Zero and a dive bomber, in a single engagement. The success was partly luck. Dick was in the right place when Japanese aircraft appeared. His flight leader positioned the group favorably for the attack, and Dick's gunnery was accurate enough to destroy both targets. But the engagement also demonstrated the methodical approach that would characterize Dick's entire combat career. He didn't charge recklessly into combat. He followed his flight leader, maintained formation discipline, and attacked only when positioned advantageously. His firing was controlled, short bursts rather than sustained fire that would waste ammunition and overheat guns. He confirmed his kills by observing the aircraft going down, then broke off the engagement rather than pursuing damaged aircraft that might lure him into traps. This disciplined approach was unusual among American fighter pilots in 1942 to 1943. Many pilots flew aggressively, sought combat actively, took risks to score kills, and treated air combat as personal duels where courage and determination mattered more than tactical positioning. This aggressive approach produced some successful aces, but also produced high casualties among pilots who took unnecessary risks. Dick's approach was different. He flew aggressively when conditions favored him, broke off when they didn't, and never pressed attacks when doing so would expose him to counterattack. He studied Japanese tactics, learned to anticipate their maneuvers, and developed techniques for exploiting P-38 advantages while minimizing exposure to Japanese aircraft's superior maneuverability. Over the following months, Dick's kill total grew steadily. By April 1943, he had 10 confirmed kills. By July 1943, he had 16. By December 1943, he had 21. The progression was consistent. Dick was flying regular combat missions, encountering Japanese aircraft frequently, and converting those encounters into kills more consistently than most of his peers. April 1944. Port Moresby, New Guinea. Richard Bong, now a major and the leading American ace in the Pacific Theater, with 28 confirmed kills, sat in a briefing room, listening to intelligence officers describe the next day's mission. Around him were other pilots from the 49th Fighter Group, most of them younger and less experienced than Bong, looking to him for leadership and hoping to learn the tactics that had kept him alive through hundreds of combat missions, while making him the most successful American fighter pilot. The mission would be a fighter sweep over Hollandia, a major Japanese base on the northern coast of New Guinea. Intelligence estimated that approximately 60 to 80 Japanese fighters would be based at Hollandia, defending against the Allied offensive that was steadily pushing Japanese forces back across New Guinea. The American force would be 12 P-38s, outnumbered by at least 5 to 1, flying over enemy territory where any pilot shot down would have no chance of rescue. A less experienced pilot might have been terrified by these odds. Bong viewed them as acceptable. The P-38s had altitude and speed advantages. American pilots had superior training and tactics, and if the engagement was fought properly, the numerical disadvantage could be mitigated by maintaining tactical discipline and refusing to be drawn into turning fights where Japanese aircraft's superior maneuverability would negate American advantages. After the briefing, younger pilots approached Bong asking for advice. What should they do if they encountered Japanese fighters? How should they position for attacks? When should they break off? Bong's answers were characteristically practical and unsentimental. Use altitude and speed advantages. Attack from above and behind whenever possible. Fire short, aimed bursts rather than sustained fire. If a Japanese aircraft gets behind you, don't try to turn with it. Dive away using superior speed. Never get slow in a turning fight. Watch your wingman and ensure someone is always watching you. Break off if the tactical situation turns against you. Surviving to fight another day is more important than scoring kills. The advice was simple, almost obvious when stated. But implementing it in the chaos of combat, when adrenaline was flowing and instincts pushed pilots toward aggressive maneuvering, required discipline that many pilots couldn't maintain. Bong's ability to follow his own tactical principles consistently, mission after mission, was what separated him from pilots who had similar skill but less disciplined approaches. The mission to Hollandia proceeded the next morning. The P-38s climbed to 24,000 feet over the target, positioning themselves above the estimated altitude of Japanese fighters. When Japanese aircraft appeared, approximately 30 Zeros climbing to intercept, Bong led the attack from superior altitude, diving on the Japanese formation at high speed, firing on 2 aircraft during the diving pass, and then extending away at full power before the Japanese could respond. 1 Zero exploded in mid-air, hit in the fuel tank by Bong's concentrated fire. A second trailed smoke and spiraled downward. Bong didn't observe the second aircraft crash. He was already diving away from the combat, building speed and altitude for another pass. This discipline, not staying to watch kills, not pressing attacks, always maintaining energy and position, was fundamental to Bong's survival and success. The engagement lasted approximately 20 minutes. The P-38s made multiple diving passes, attacking from altitude and speed, avoiding sustained turning engagements that would favor the more maneuverable Japanese fighters. When the Japanese attempted to set up defensive formations that would trap the Americans in low-speed maneuvering, Bong ordered his flight to disengage, diving away to safety and declining to fight on terms that favored the enemy. The final score from the mission was 8 Japanese aircraft confirmed destroyed, 3 probables, and no American losses. Bong was credited with 2 kills, bringing his total to 30. The mission demonstrated the tactical principles that Bong had been refining for over a year. Use advantages, avoid enemy strengths, maintain discipline, survive to fight again. But the mission also demonstrated a larger reality about the Pacific Air War in 1944. American forces were winning decisively. The Japanese pilots at Hollandia, while brave and determined, were less experienced than the American pilots, had inferior training, and were flying aircraft that, while still capable, were being outclassed by improved American fighters and tactics. The kill ratio of 8-0 reflected this growing disparity. In early 1944, the Japanese air forces in the Pacific were disintegrating under sustained American pressure. The best Japanese pilots, the veterans who had fought since 1941, were mostly dead, shot down during the grinding attrition battles of 1942 to 1943. Their replacements were increasingly poorly trained, receiving abbreviated instruction because Japan lacked fuel, time, and experienced instructors. Japanese aircraft production couldn't keep pace with losses, and the aircraft that were produced were often inferior to the latest American fighters. American forces, by contrast, were at peak strength and effectiveness. Pilot training had been refined and expanded, producing large numbers of well-trained pilots. Aircraft production was overwhelming. Thousands of fighters were being manufactured monthly, ensuring that losses were replaced immediately. Tactics had been developed through combat experience, and those tactics were being systematically taught to new pilots, spreading the lessons that veterans like Bong had learned through hard experience. This disparity meant that American aces like Bong were encountering what were often called target-rich environments, situations where multiple enemy aircraft were available to engage, where American tactical and equipment advantages made it relatively safe to press attacks, and where kills accumulated quickly for skilled pilots. But relatively safe didn't mean safe. Pilots were still being killed, hit by lucky shots, making mistakes in judgment, experiencing mechanical failures, or simply being in the wrong place when circumstances turned against them. Every combat mission carried risk, and accumulating kills meant accumulating exposure to that risk. The more missions you flew, the more opportunities for something to go wrong. Bong understood this statistical reality. He knew that his survival through hundreds of combat missions was partly skill but also partly luck, and that luck could run out at any time. This understanding informed his tactical conservatism. He took calculated risks when the situation favored him, but he never took unnecessary risks in pursuit of glory or additional kills. By April 1944, Bong had become a public figure in the United States. His success was being reported in newspapers, his photograph appeared in magazines, and he was being celebrated as America's top ace, the pilot who was defeating Japanese forces in individual combat and demonstrating American superiority in the air war. The publicity made Bong uncomfortable. He was fundamentally modest, never sought attention, and viewed himself as simply doing his job rather than being particularly heroic. When reporters interviewed him, his responses were brief and factual. He described tactics and aircraft performance but deflected questions about fear, heroism, or how it felt to shoot down enemy aircraft. But the publicity served larger purposes beyond Bong's personal comfort. American morale in 1944 needed heroes, individuals who embodied American values and demonstrated that Americans could defeat enemies in individual combat. Bong, with his Midwestern farm boy background and his methodical approach to air combat, fit the narrative perfectly. He was presented to the public as the all-American hero, humble, effective, deadly to enemies, but modest about his accomplishments. General George Kenney, who commanded the Allied Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific, and who had been Bong's supporter since the Golden Gate Bridge incident, recognized Bong's value both as a combat pilot and as a symbol. Kenney promoted Bong's achievements, ensured that his combat reports were circulated widely, and used Bong as an example when training new pilots about effective tactics. But Kenney also worried about Bong's survival. By mid-1944, Bong had flown over 200 combat missions, more than any other American fighter pilot in the Pacific. Statistical probability suggested that Bong's luck would eventually run out, that he would be killed or shot down despite his skill and caution. Kenney didn't want to lose Bong to combat after he had survived so long and had become so valuable as a symbol and instructor. In April 1944, Kenney ordered Bong back to the United States for a publicity tour and for rest. Bong had been in combat for over 18 months, had accumulated 28 kills, and needed a break from the stress of continuous combat operations. The publicity tour would allow Bong to contribute to morale and war bond drives, while giving him time to recover psychologically from the strain of combat. Bong returned to the United States in May 1944, traveling to Wisconsin to visit his family, then participating in war bond rallies and public appearances across the country. The reception was overwhelming. Crowds gathered to see America's top ace. Newspapers covered his appearances extensively, and Bong was treated as a celebrity everywhere he went. But Bong remained uncomfortable with fame. In interviews, he deflected credit to his fellow pilots, emphasized that his success was due to good aircraft and good tactics rather than individual heroism, and generally tried to minimize the attention focused on him. His modesty, rather than reducing public interest, actually increased it. Americans appreciated a hero who didn't seek glory, whose humility contrasted with stereotypes about egotistical fighter pilots. During his time in the United States, Bong also fell in love. He met Marjorie Vattendahl, a woman from Superior, Wisconsin, who worked for the Office of War Information. They began dating during Bong's leave, and despite the brief courtship, both quickly recognized that they wanted to marry. But marriage would have to wait. Bong's leave was ending, and he was scheduled to return to the Pacific in September 1944. Bong requested permission to remain in the United States as an instructor, using his combat experience to train new pilots rather than returning to combat himself. But the request was denied. Bong was too valuable as a combat pilot, and General Kenney specifically wanted him back in the Pacific Theater. Moreover, Bong himself felt obligated to return. His squadron was still fighting, pilots he had trained were in combat, and he felt responsibility to continue serving alongside them rather than accepting safe assignment in the United States while others faced danger. In September 1944, Bong returned to the Southwest Pacific, now assigned to the 5th Air Force Headquarters as an advanced gunnery instructor, but with authorization to fly combat missions when opportunities arose. This assignment was a compromise. Bong would primarily teach tactics to new pilots, but could continue accumulating kills when mission requirements allowed. The Pacific Air War in late 1944 was dramatically different from what Bong had experienced in 1942 and 1943. American forces were advancing rapidly across the Pacific, conducting amphibious invasions that steadily reduced Japanese-held territory. The Philippines were being liberated, with American forces landing at Leyte in October 1944. Japanese air opposition was weakening. Pilot quality had declined severely, aircraft numbers were diminishing, and Japanese tactics were becoming increasingly desperate. In October 1944, Bong flew missions during the Philippines campaign, protecting American ground forces and naval vessels from Japanese air attack. Japanese resistance was fierce but increasingly ineffective. Kamikaze attacks were becoming common as Japan resorted to suicide tactics, but conventional Japanese air combat capability was collapsing. On October 10, 1944, Bong shot down his 36th and 37th confirmed victories, 2 Japanese fighters over Leyte. The engagement was almost routine. Bong positioned himself advantageously, attacked from altitude, shot down both aircraft with short, precise bursts, and returned to base safely. The kills brought him within 3 of the American record of 40 kills, which had been held by Eddie Rickenbacker since World War I. The record became a focus of public attention. Newspapers tracked Bong's progress toward Rickenbacker's record, speculating about when he would surpass it and become America's all-time leading ace. The publicity created pressure that Bong found uncomfortable. He was competing against his own survival, where each additional mission increased the probability of being killed, and the public attention made the achievement seem more important than it actually was. On October 28, 1944, Bong shot down his 38th and 39th victories, 2 more Japanese fighters over Leyte. He was now 1 kill away from tying Rickenbacker's record, one of the most famous records in American military aviation history. The entire Pacific Theater seemed focused on whether Bong would survive long enough to reach 40 kills and surpass the record. General Kenny, worried about Bong's survival and concerned that the pressure to reach 40 kills might cause Bong to take unnecessary risks, considered ordering Bong to stop flying combat missions until proper arrangements could be made for the record-breaking achievement. But Kenny recognized that such an order would be insulting to Bong, would suggest that his personal achievement was more important than the mission, and would be inconsistent with Bong's approach to combat throughout his career. On November 15, 1944, Bong flew a mission over Leyte Gulf where American naval forces were operating. Japanese aircraft attacked the naval vessels, and Bong's flight intercepted them. In the engagement, Bong shot down a Japanese fighter, his 40th confirmed victory, tying Rickenbacker's World War I record. But rather than celebrating, Bong simply filed his combat report and continued flying missions. He didn't view 40 kills as particularly significant. It was just another number, another Japanese aircraft destroyed, another mission completed successfully. The public and military leadership viewed it as historic achievement, but to Bong it was just confirmation that his tactics continued to work and that he had survived another mission. On December 17, 1944, Bong shot down 2 more Japanese aircraft in a single mission, his 41st and 42nd victories, surpassing Rickenbacker and becoming America's all-time leading ace. The achievement made headlines across the United States. Rickenbacker, who was still alive and was a respected elder statesman of American aviation, sent congratulations, and publicly praised Bong's achievement. But the achievement also created a dilemma for military leadership. Bong had broken the record and become the leading American ace of all time. Continuing to fly combat missions risked losing him to enemy action or accident, which would be a propaganda disaster and would eliminate a valuable instructor and symbol. But pulling Bong from combat would suggest that records and propaganda value were more important than the mission and would be inconsistent with military values about every pilot contributing regardless of individual achievement. General Kenny made the decision. Bong would continue flying combat missions through December 1944, completing his current tour, and would then return to the United States permanently. His combat career complete. Bong would be assigned to test pilot duties and to training responsibilities, contributing his experience to improving aircraft and tactics without further risking his life in combat. In late December 1944, Bong continued flying missions, adding 3 more kills, his 43rd, 44th, and 45th victories, before completing his final combat mission on December 17, 1944. Wait, that's wrong. Let me correct the timeline. Actually, Bong's 40th victory occurred on December 17, 1944, surpassing Rickenbacker's record. His final combat missions were on December 15th and 17th, 1944, when he shot down his 40th confirmed victory. After reaching 40 kills, General Kenny ordered Bong to stop flying combat missions, ending his combat career at exactly 40 confirmed victories. The number 40 was significant, not because Bong had set it as a goal, but because it happened to be where military leadership decided to end his combat career. If Kenny had made the decision one mission earlier or later, Bong's final total would have been different. The record was partly achievement and partly arbitrary timing of when leadership decided the propaganda risk of losing him outweighed the tactical value of him continuing to fly. Bong's final combat mission on December 17, 1944, was characteristically successful but unremarkable. He flew escort for bombers, encountered Japanese fighters, shot down 1 aircraft, his 40th, and returned to base safely. It was almost identical to dozens of previous missions, methodical execution of proven tactics resulting in another victory and another successful return. After the mission, Kenny informed Bong that his combat career was over. He would be returning to the United States, would be awarded the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration, would marry Marjorie, and would serve out the rest of the war as a test pilot and instructor without returning to combat. Bong's reaction was mixed. He was relieved to have survived, was happy about the prospect of marriage and normal life, and was tired after 2.5 years of combat operations. But he also felt guilty about leaving while his squadron continued fighting, felt that accepting safe assignment while others remained in danger was somehow dishonorable, and worried that he was being treated differently because of his record rather than being judged by the same standards as every other pilot. These feelings reflected Bong's character: modest, focused on duty rather than glory, uncomfortable with special treatment, and feeling responsibility to his fellow pilots that exceeded concern for his own survival or achievement. These same qualities had made him an effective combat pilot and had kept him alive through hundreds of missions, but they made it difficult for him to accept that his combat career was over for reasons of propaganda value rather than mission requirements. Bong returned to the United States in January 1945. On December 12, 1944, before he actually left the Pacific, General MacArthur presented him with the Medal of Honor at a ceremony in the Philippines. The citation read, For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action above and beyond the call of duty in the Southwest Pacific area from 10th October to 15th November 1943. Though assigned to duty as gunnery instructor, and neither required nor expected to perform combat duty, Major Bong voluntarily, and at his own urgent request, engaged in repeated combat missions, including unusually hazardous sorties over Balikpapan, Borneo, and in the Leyte area of the Philippines. His aggressiveness and daring resulted in his shooting down 8 enemy airplanes during this period. The citation was typical of Medal of Honor awards. Formal language that conveyed the basic facts, but didn't capture the sustained excellence and consistent tactical discipline that had actually characterized Bong's career. But the award recognized Bong's achievement and provided formal acknowledgement of his contribution to American victory in the Pacific Air War. In February 1945, Bong married Marjorie Vattendahl in Superior, Wisconsin. The wedding was covered extensively by newspapers and magazines. America's top ace marrying his sweetheart from his hometown created perfect human interest story that the public loved. The couple honeymooned briefly before Bong reported for his new assignment. Bong was assigned to Lockheed as a test pilot, evaluating new fighter aircraft and providing combat pilot perspective on aircraft design and performance. One of the aircraft he was assigned to test was the P-38 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter. The P-38 represented the future of fighter aviation. Jet propulsion provided higher speeds than propeller-driven aircraft could achieve, and the transition to jets would fundamentally change air combat tactics and strategy. But the P-80 was also dangerous. Jet engine technology in 1945 was new and not fully reliable. Engine failures were common. Aircraft systems were complex and not fully debugged. Test pilots were essentially experimenting with technology that wasn't yet mature, accepting risks that were higher than combat operations because the development of next-generation fighters required understanding those risks. On August 6, 1945, the day that the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, Richard Bong was preparing for a test flight in the P-80 at Lockheed's facility in Burbank, California. The flight was routine, evaluating aircraft systems, testing performance at various airspeeds and altitudes, documenting any anomalies for engineering review. August 6, 1945. Lockheed Air Terminal, Burbank, California. 2:30 p.m. Richard Bong climbed into the cockpit of the P-80 Shooting Star, preparing for what should have been a routine test flight. The aircraft was one of the early production models of America's first operational jet fighter, a revolutionary aircraft that represented the future of air combat, but that was still experiencing the technical problems inevitable with new technology. Bong had flown the P-80 several times over the previous weeks, was familiar with its handling characteristics, and understood the aircraft's systems well enough to conduct test pilot duties effectively. But he was also aware that the P-80 had reliability issues, engines that could fail without warning, systems that behaved unpredictably, and overall complexity that exceeded anything he had flown during combat operations. At approximately 2:45 p.m., Bong began his takeoff roll. The P-80 accelerated down the runway, and Bong lifted off, retracting the landing gear as the aircraft climbed away from the airfield. But almost immediately, something went wrong. The engine lost power, faltered, and the aircraft began losing altitude instead of continuing its climb. Bong was at approximately 300 feet altitude, too low to bail out successfully even if he had immediately decided to abandon the aircraft. He attempted to restart the engine, following emergency procedures that should have restored power. But the engine didn't respond. Whatever had caused the failure was complete, and the aircraft was now a glider with poor gliding characteristics, too low to reach the runway, and rapidly approaching the ground. Bong had seconds to make decisions. He could try to belly land the aircraft on open ground, hoping to survive the crash. He could attempt to reach the runway, though altitude and distance made that extremely unlikely. Or he could aim the aircraft away from populated areas and ride it down, accepting certain death but preventing the aircraft from crashing into buildings where others might be killed. Witnesses on the ground reported that Bong appeared to turn the aircraft away from populated areas, steering toward open ground as the P-80 descended. But at approximately 300 feet, the aircraft's nose dropped sharply. The turn became a spin, and the P-80 crashed into a field near the airfield, exploding on impact. Richard Bong died instantly. He was 24 years old. He had survived hundreds of combat missions, had shot down 40 Japanese aircraft, had become America's leading ace, and had made it home from the war alive. But he died 8 months after his final combat mission, killed not by enemy action, but by mechanical failure in a peacetime test flight. The timing was particularly tragic. Bong died on the same day that the atomic bomb destroyed Hiroshima, beginning the final chapter of World War II. Newspapers the next day had to decide whether to lead with the atomic bomb or with Bong's death. Most chose the bomb, relegating Bong's death to secondary coverage, which seemed somehow appropriate for a pilot who had never sought publicity and who would have preferred not to compete for headlines with the weapon that would end the war. The investigation into Bong's crash identified the cause as failure of the P-80's fuel pump system. The primary fuel pump had failed, and the backup emergency fuel pump, which should have automatically engaged, had also failed due to a wiring problem. Without fuel pressure, the engine had stopped, and at 300 feet altitude with insufficient airspeed to reach the runway, Bong had no options that would have resulted in survival. The investigators concluded that Bong had done everything correctly. He had attempted to restart the engine, had steered away from populated areas, had tried to set up for emergency landing. But the combination of altitude, airspeed, and aircraft characteristics made survival impossible once both fuel pumps failed. The crash was attributed to mechanical failure rather than to pilot error, and the fuel pump system was redesigned based on lessons from the accident. But these conclusions, while technically accurate, didn't diminish the tragedy of losing America's top ace to a mechanical failure in a peacetime accident. Bong had cheated death for 2.5 years in combat, had survived when probability suggested he should have been killed, and had finally been killed by a fuel pump malfunction that had nothing to do with combat or heroism or any of the reasons that fighter pilots die. The funeral was held in Poplar, Wisconsin, on August 11, 1945, 5 days after Bong's death and 2 days after the atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The war was effectively over. Japan would surrender on August 15th, and Bong's funeral became one of the last significant military ceremonies of World War II. Over 1,000 people attended, far more than Poplar could accommodate, requiring the service to be held outdoors. Marjorie Bong, widowed after only 6 months of marriage, received the flag from her husband's coffin. She was 24 years old, the same age as Dick had been when he died, and her life had been completely changed by 6 months of marriage to America's top ace followed by sudden widowhood. General George Kenney delivered the eulogy, speaking about Bong's courage, his skill, his modesty, and his contribution to American victory in the Pacific. Kenney emphasized that Bong had been a great pilot, not because of natural talent or reckless courage, but because of disciplined application of sound tactical principles, careful study of his profession, and consistent refusal to take unnecessary risks. These qualities, Kenney argued, were what young pilots should emulate. Not dramatic heroics, but professional competence and disciplined execution. The eulogy was accurate, but also served to establish how Bong should be remembered, not as a kill-seeking ace who gloried in combat, but as a professional warrior who did his duty effectively, survived through skill and discipline, and contributed to victory through consistent application of proven tactics. This narrative, while accurate, also made Bong's story less dramatic than the public might have preferred, transforming him from fighter ace into example of military professionalism. Bong was buried with full military honors in Poplar Cemetery. His grave was marked with a simple military headstone, identical to thousands of others that marked the graves of servicemen who died during the war. The simplicity was appropriate for someone who had never sought special recognition and who would have been uncomfortable with elaborate memorials. In the years immediately after the war, Bong's fame faded relatively quickly. He had been a wartime hero, but the war was over, and America was focused on peace, reconstruction, and the emerging Cold War. The fighter aces of World War II, who had been celebrities during the war, found that public interest in their achievements diminished as America moved on from wartime concerns. But within military aviation circles, Bong's legacy remained important. The tactics he had developed and exemplified, using altitude and speed advantages, firing short-aimed bursts, maintaining energy and position, refusing to be drawn into turning fights, became foundational to American fighter doctrine. The Air Force taught these principles to new generations of fighter pilots, and Bong's combat reports were studied as examples of effective tactics properly executed. The transition to jet aircraft, which was occurring when Bong died, made some of his specific tactics obsolete. Jet fighters were faster and less maneuverable than the P-38, requiring different approaches to air combat. But the underlying principles, use your advantages, avoid enemy strengths, maintain discipline, prioritize survival, remained relevant regardless of aircraft technology. In the 1950s and 1960s, during the Korean War and the early years of the Vietnam War, American fighter pilots continued to reference Bong's example. His emphasis on gunnery accuracy was particularly relevant in the early jet age, when missiles were unreliable and air combat often came down to guns. His approach of studying enemy tactics and developing counters to them influenced American training programs that analyzed Soviet and Chinese fighter tactics to prepare pilots for combat. Memorials to Bong were established gradually over the decades following his death. In 1950, the Bong Memorial Bridge was dedicated in Superior, Wisconsin, connecting Wisconsin to Minnesota across the St. Louis Bay. The bridge became one of the most prominent structures in Bong's hometown, ensuring that his name would be familiar to anyone traveling through the region. In 1972, Richard Firsted Bong State Recreation Area was established in Wisconsin, a 4,500-acre park that provided recreation opportunities while honoring Bong's memory. The park included a veterans memorial and an aviation heritage center, documenting Bong's career and the broader history of Wisconsin's contribution to military aviation. In 1986, the Bong Veterans Historical Center opened in Superior, Wisconsin, a museum dedicated to preserving Bong's legacy and honoring all veterans from the region. The museum displays one of Bong's P-38 aircraft, his Medal of Honor, his flight suits and personal equipment, and extensive documentation of his combat career. The museum has become a pilgrimage site for aviation enthusiasts and for people interested in World War II history. These memorials reflected growing historical interest in World War II as the generation that fought the war began to pass away. In the 1970s and 1980s, there was renewed public interest in preserving the memory of wartime service, and ensuring that the sacrifices of the war generation were remembered. Bong, as America's top ace, became a symbol of American air superiority during the war and a representative of the thousands of fighter pilots who had fought in the Pacific Theater. But the memorials also reflected tension about how to remember Bong. Should he be remembered primarily for his 40 kills, emphasizing his effectiveness as a combat pilot? Or should he be remembered for his character, his modesty, his discipline, his professional approach to combat? Different people emphasized different aspects of his legacy, creating somewhat different narratives about what his story meant and what lessons should be drawn from it. Military historians studying Bong's career have generally emphasized his tactical innovations and his consistency. Unlike some aces whose high kill totals resulted from occasional spectacular missions with multiple kills, Bong accumulated his victories steadily through consistent application of effective tactics. He had several missions where he shot down multiple aircraft, but most of his kills came from missions where he shot down one or two aircraft while maintaining the disciplined approach that kept him alive. This consistency is what made Bong exceptional. Many pilots could execute effective tactics occasionally, when circumstances favored them and when they happened to make correct decisions. Bong executed effective tactics consistently, mission after mission, maintaining discipline even under stress, even when aggressive impulses pushed toward less tactical approaches, even when maintaining discipline meant passing up opportunities that might have produced additional kills but would have increased risk. The statistical analysis of Bong's combat record is revealing. He flew approximately 200 combat missions and scored 40 confirmed kills, an average of 1 kill per 5 missions. This might seem low compared to some aces who had higher ratios, but it reflected the reality that most combat missions didn't involve enemy contact, and many missions that did involve enemy contact didn't result in kills either because circumstances weren't favorable or because maintaining tactical discipline required breaking off before kills could be confirmed. Bong's gunnery accuracy was exceptional. His percentage of combat sorties resulting in kills was higher than the average for fighter pilots in his theater. More importantly, his survival rate was 100% through 200 missions, meaning he never had to bail out, never crash-landed due to combat damage, never was wounded seriously enough to miss significant time from flying. This survival rate, combined with high kill rate, is what made Bong's record so exceptional. He was effective and he survived, a combination that was rarer than either characteristic alone. Comparing Bong to other high-scoring aces reveals instructive patterns. Many aces with very high kill totals, particularly German, aces on the Eastern Front, who shot down hundreds of Soviet aircraft, were flying in target-rich environments where enemy aircraft were numerous and often poorly flown. These aces accumulated kills quickly, but also often died relatively young in their combat careers because constant exposure to combat eventually resulted in being shot down. Bong flew in a target-rich environment in 1943 to 1944, when Japanese air opposition was heavy, but he survived long enough to see the environment change as Japanese air power declined. His tactical discipline, never pressing attacks when circumstances turned against him, enabled him to survive the most dangerous period and continue flying when conditions became more favorable. The question of whether Bong was the best fighter pilot in American history is debated among aviation historians. By confirmed kills, he was certainly the most successful. But best could mean different things. Most skilled in aircraft handling, best tactician, best leader, best instructor, most valuable overall contribution. Different criteria produce different answers. What seems clear is that Bong was among the most effective American fighter pilots in combining lethality with survival. He scored many kills and survived to the end of his combat career. This combination, effectiveness without death, is arguably more valuable than pure kill totals that end with the pilot's death, because pilots who survive can continue contributing through additional missions and through passing their knowledge to others. Bong's instructional contribution during his final months in the Pacific was significant. He flew with new pilots, demonstrated tactics, debriefed them after missions, and helped them develop the skills that would keep them alive and effective. The pilots he trained went on to fly hundreds of missions, and some became aces themselves. This multiplier effect, one experienced pilot training many newer pilots, who collectively achieve far more than the original pilot could alone, is how knowledge and tactical innovation spread through military organizations. The tragedy of Bong's death in the P-38 crash was compounded by the timing. Just 8 months after his combat career ended, he was killed by mechanical failure in an aircraft that represented the future of aviation. If he had survived just a few more months, past the end of the war, he could have left test flying and pursued a normal post-war life. But test flying in 1945, with immature jet technology and inadequate safety systems, was arguably more dangerous than the combat flying he had survived. The P-80 crash also highlighted a broader issue about military test pilots. They were conducting experiments with immature technology, accepting risks that were difficult to quantify, and often dying in accidents that revealed design flaws. The fuel pump failure that killed Bong led to redesign of the P-80's fuel system, making the aircraft safer for subsequent pilots. But that improvement came at the cost of Bong's life, raising questions about whether test flying procedures adequately protected pilots or whether pilots were being treated as expendable in pursuit of rapid aircraft development. For Marjorie Bong, widowed at 24 after only 6 months of marriage, the loss was personally devastating. She never remarried, living the rest of her life as Bong's widow, preserving his memory and participating in memorial events honoring his service. She died in 2003 at age 82, having spent 58 years as a widow, her life fundamentally defined by 6 months of marriage to America's top ace. Her experience was shared by thousands of war widows whose husbands died during or shortly after the war, whose lives were permanently altered by brief marriages followed by decades of widowhood. These women were honored as war widows, a category that recognized their sacrifice but also defined them primarily through their relationship to dead servicemen rather than as individuals with their own achievements and identities. The broader impact of Bong's career on American military aviation extended beyond tactics and doctrine to questions of pilot selection and training. Bong had not been identified as an exceptional pilot during training. He had been competent, but not outstanding, had demonstrated good judgment, but not dramatic flying skills. Yet he became the most successful American fighter pilot in history. This suggested that the qualities that made effective combat pilots were different from the qualities that training programs were selecting for. Natural flying ability and aerobatic skills, which training programs emphasized, were less important than tactical judgment, discipline, gunnery accuracy, and ability to maintain composure under stress. Bong possessed these latter qualities in abundance despite being unremarkable in the former. Post-war pilot selection programs attempted to incorporate these lessons, adding psychological screening and tactical evaluation to supplement tests of basic flying skills. The recognition that combat effectiveness required mental and psychological attributes beyond just physical flying skills influenced how the Air Force recruited and trained pilots through the jet age and into the modern era. Bong's legacy also influenced discussions about fighter tactics in the jet age. The transition from propeller-driven fighters to jets fundamentally changed air combat. Higher speeds, longer ranges, missile armament instead of guns, radar-guided intercepts instead of visual engagements. Some of Bong's specific tactics became obsolete as technology changed, but the underlying principles remained relevant. Use your advantages. Understand enemy capabilities and limitations. Maintain energy and position. Fire accurately rather than wastefully. Know when to press attacks and when to disengage. These principles, which Bong had exemplified in the P-38, remained foundational to fighter tactics in F-86s, F-4s, F-15s, and modern fighters. The Vietnam War, where American fighter pilots faced Soviet-trained adversaries flying Soviet aircraft, demonstrated the continued relevance of Bong's tactical approach. American pilots who studied their adversaries' capabilities, who maintained tactical discipline, and who used American aircraft's advantages effectively achieved success. Pilots who engaged in turning dogfights that favored more maneuverable Soviet aircraft often failed. The lessons were the same ones Bong had demonstrated 30 years earlier in the Pacific. Modern fighter pilots, flying aircraft that Bong couldn't have imagined, supersonic jets with beyond visual range missiles, advanced radar and sensor systems, network-centric warfare capabilities, still study Bong's combat reports as examples of how to think about air combat. The technology has changed completely, but the cognitive and tactical principles that made Bong effective remain relevant. The 40 kills that made Bong famous were, in some ways, the least important aspect of his legacy. The kills were results, important results that contributed to American victory in the Pacific, but results that reflected underlying qualities that were more significant than the numbers themselves. Bong's tactical discipline, his professional approach to combat, his ability to study and learn from each engagement, his consistency in applying proven techniques, these qualities produced the 40 kills, but would have made him valuable even if his kill total had been lower. The American fighter pilot tradition that Bong helped establish, professional rather than romantic, tactical rather than heroic, focused on effectiveness rather than glory, shaped American military aviation through the Cold War and beyond. The contrast between this approach and the more individualistic, glory-seeking tradition of fighter pilots in some other nations reflected different military cultures and different values about what made effective warriors. Richard Bong's story ends not with glory in combat, but with death in a peacetime accident, not with dramatic final battle, but with mechanical failure during a routine test flight, not with satisfying conclusion, but with tragic waste of potential. He survived the war only to die months later. Survived hundreds of combat missions only to be killed by a fuel pump malfunction. This ending, while tragic, is somehow appropriate for a pilot who never sought drama or glory, who approached combat as a professional rather than as an adventurer, who measured success by mission completion and survival rather than by individual achievement. Bong's story is not a romantic tale of fighter pilot heroics, but a story of professional competence applied consistently under extreme pressure, producing exceptional results through disciplined execution rather than through dramatic gestures. The farm boy from Wisconsin, who became America's deadliest fighter pilot, did so not through extraordinary natural talent or reckless courage, but through steady application of sound tactical principles, careful study of his profession, and refusal to take unnecessary risks. He shot down 40 Japanese aircraft using tactics that prioritized survival and effectiveness over glory and individual achievement. He returned from the war alive, married the woman he loved, and then died in an accident that had nothing to do with combat or heroism. His legacy is preserved in memorials and museums in fighter pilot training programs that still teach the tactics he exemplified, in the P-38 displayed at the Bong Veterans Historical Center, and in the memory of a generation of Americans who knew him as their top ace, their deadliest fighter pilot, their modest farm boy hero who became a legend, not by seeking glory, but by doing his duty effectively and professionally, mission after mission after mission, until the war was won and he could finally come home. Richard Dick Bong, America's ace of aces, 40 confirmed victories, Medal of Honor recipient, test pilot, farm boy from Superior, Wisconsin, who became the most successful American fighter pilot in history by refusing to be dramatic, by maintaining discipline, by studying his profession, and by surviving through consistent application of tactics that worked. Dead at 24 in a peacetime accident, 8 months after his final combat mission, 8 days after the war ended with the dropping of atomic bombs that made fighter aces seem like relics of a war that was already becoming history. His story endures not because of the 40 kills, though they were impressive, but because of what the kills represented. Professional excellence applied consistently under conditions where most people would have failed, discipline maintained when instinct pushed toward aggression, survival achieved when probability suggested death. The story of how a modest farm boy became America's deadliest fighter pilot by being exactly what fighter pilots should be, but often aren't: careful, methodical, disciplined, effective, and professional in the truest sense of the word.